Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Live with CXPA. This is the first of two live stream events that we have planned for this week. We're so happy you're with us. Today's topic is really going to be focused on reasons why CX programs fail. I am Gabe Smith, CCXP. I'm the content manager for the CXPA, the Customer Experience Professionals Association, and I'm excited to have this conversation today. Not only to really work through some of the reasons why CX programs don't succeed, but to tease out how your program can avoid some of those same pitfalls. We're going to be discussing some recent research that Farlinium has conducted on this topic. We're also going to be diving into some of the data and some of the open-ended comments to shed some more light on this. But first, as always, I want to hear from you. Where are you viewing from? And, let's get started. Share some successes that you've had this week. What are some of your highs for this week? Want to hear from you. I am in Akron, Ohio. I'm in somewhat of a darkened room, a little bit different room than what I usually are coming to you from. Having some thunderstorms coming through this area, so fingers crossed we don't have any issues there. I'm going to say, in fact, there are going to be no issues. So let me hear from you. Where are you tuning in from today? Okay. So want to hear from you? Oh, great. Got our first comment coming in. Hey, Lama, welcome. Lama's joining us from Palestine. Phenomenal. Let us know where you're tuning in from. So I want to bring in some of our guests. Keep getting those comments in. Let us know where you're tuning in from, what's your high for the week. So I want to start to bring in our guests for today. Our first guest is Farzad Aref, CCXP. Farzad is the founder and CEO of Farlinium. He is an ex-Big Four consultant holding 5 patents with 2 decades of hands-on experience in converging process, people, and technology to maximize value through transformative analytics programs for Fortune 100 companies. So welcome to the program, Farzad.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Gabe. Looking forward to the conversations.
Absolutely. And also would like to bring in Lorraine Schumacher, CCXP. Lorraine has been on the CXPA board of directors from 2015 to 2020. She's advised multiple executives and organizations on improving business results through CX transformation. She's achieved significant success over a 20-plus year history at Verizon within a breadth of disciplines, including standing up with their corporate-wide CX program and technology. She has worked with a variety of organizations, including Fortune 100 companies, to operationalize their CX technology and improve CX. So welcome, Lorraine.
Hi, everybody.
So Lorraine and Farzad, always love to hear from folks tuning in from around the world. So let's take a quick trip around the world and see where people are joining us from. We have Carrie joining us from Austin, Texas, one of my favorite places in the world and a place where I lived for 13 years. Welcome, Carrie. We have Srikanth joining us from Dubai, another Austinite. We have Jessica joining us from Fairfax, Virginia. We have Alex joining us from Lexington, Kentucky. Phenomenal. We have Lisa joining us from London. Tracy joining us from Lagos, Nigeria. Wonderful to see you, Tracy. And we have Vincent joining us from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Wonderful. Deepak joining us from India. Always love to see your comments. Love to see the global engagement that we have in the live streams. Be sure to get in your highs. What's your high for the week? Something you're excited about this week. Would love to hear from that as well. So, I want to kick us off here, Farzad and Lorraine.
Yep.
I know, Lorraine, that you were really a catalyst for kickstarting this research into this really critical question of why do CX programs fail? So tell me a little bit about what sparked your interest in this topic and how do we get from that initial interest to where we are today of being in a position to share some of this data?
Yeah, absolutely. So, how New Year's rolls around, it's the beginning of the year and you start looking back over, your wins and losses from last year. And 2020 was a strange year for all of us around the world. And I really started thinking about over the last 8 to 10 years within CX, what is different? Why are people still struggling with it? And so then I started doing a little bit of research. And by research, it was totally non-scientific, right? I talked to my friends, my peeps in CX, and I started looking at some of the white papers and blogs that were out there. And I actually came across something that was published in 2016, that was then repackaged and republished at the end of 2019, and nothing had changed. It was the exact same article. And so that really started me thinking, what's different? Why is it different? We feel that we've come a long way, but we're still dealing with the same struggles. So basically, I put a little blog together. I reached out to Farzad and said, hey, let's kind of make this a little bit more scientific than just Lorraine going out there and talking to her friends, who may just commiserate with me. Let's see what the real data shows us. And so we posted the blog, and we asked people to respond to the survey so that we could spark a conversation like this to really talk about what has changed. Are the struggles still the same? Or if the struggles are different, but they're still around the same topics, what's really moved over the last 10 years?
Yeah, I love that, Lorraine. Kind of the New Year's resolution. That's awesome. So Farzad, as you were talking a little with Lorraine about this, what was interesting to you about this as a research topic? And tell us a little bit about your overall results, or your overall approach, I should say, to the study.
Absolutely, Gabe. So yeah, this is a topic that's very near dear to my heart. So we focus a lot in essentially implementing technologies that backs the voice of customer programs and customer experience programs. And a lot of times what we find in the implementation side, when we're standing up the technology, there's the tactical items to figure out, right? How are we going to stitch the data together? Are we going to have the right set of information? Are we going to be looking at feedback across all the sources? But then when we kind of look at the outcomes, right, as we start to think through that, what is this going to fuel at the end of the day, right? I think of customer experience as essentially being change, right? Ambassadors of change. There's a lot of questions that starts to come on our side in terms of, well, what is the overarching strategy that we're going to be linking this to? And most importantly, as we put together these charts and dashboards, right, we show these exciting trends for metrics. As we think about, your customers' feedback, what is that organization going to do with it, and which department is going to be the one that's going to be acting on this? So we started to come across a lot of different challenges as we think about that. I've been conversating around this with Lorraine, and she had her New Year's resolution. And again, the consultant side of me said, that's great. Let's look at like the information that you've gotten and essentially survey, the community and kind of see what everybody is seeing. And this is how it came together.
Yeah, no, that's great background, and we'd love to start to walk through some of these results. I know we've got some data that we've got here to show. So take us through, kind of walk us through a little bit about your respondents, and some of the methodology behind your creation of this survey instrument.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, we wanted to keep it simple. We were looking more for a way to have a conversation and have engagement. So that was sort of one of the things that was going to be critical in this process. As we brainstormed, as I sat down with Lorraine, I think it basically came down to these three areas. Not shocking to everyone. It's going to be around strategy, culture, and execution. So Lorraine was instrumental in helping us essentially devise a very simple questionnaire to help us understand, as we reach out to the community, what are those areas that they see most pressing, or essentially the biggest obstacles they're encountering, whether it's these three areas, or share, if there's other areas that comes to mind. And then we want to kind of understand the impact of change, right? We've had a lot of worldly events happen in the last 18, 19 months as we think about the pandemic, and a lot of shifts before then. So we just wanted to see from observations in the field, how has that changed over time, and are there any other thoughts, right, that the participants want to contribute. So we opened this survey up and kept it only running for about a month and a half, just grassroots, shared it in our networks. And again, it was more about getting sort of that personal experience as we think about the engagement piece of it.
Yeah.
In terms of the responses, it was actually really interesting to see. We kind of wanted it to be open to all the personas as we think about the CX space. So people that are consulting and advising in the space, the actual practitioners that have to make this work, they're in the trenches, as well as the vendors as well who are providing solutions, right? Whether it's technology or other means to enable this. And as you all can see, we had a pretty good distribution of feedback, right? Had a good perspective coming from the consulting side. So this is going to give us sort of glimpses of what it takes from an outside in view as we look at sort of the consulting side. And then practitioners, most important for me to kind of understand in the trenches, in the field, what they're encountering. And also from a vendor side, as they're kind of preaching and bringing these sort of innovations that are available, what are they encountering?
Yeah. Great. I love to see this breakdown. And I also love to know about the breakdown of our viewing audience. So if you get a second, pop into the comments, or, are you a consultant? Are you a practitioner? Are you a vendor? Would love to understand, a little bit more about you as you're tuning in today and looking to understand this topic better. And it's interesting too, we've got these groups, Farzad, you're sort of representing that vendor perspective. Lorraine, I know you've spent time in both the practitioner and the consultant camps. And I also like to bring on a third guest to really bring someone in who's firmly planted in that practitioner space, and that is Allison Circle, CCXP. Allison is the Chief Experience Officer at the Columbus Metropolitan Library in Columbus, Ohio. She serves on the executive leadership team there and oversees 23 library locations, as well as all programs and products. She leads programs, experience, and design for the library's new building program, 10 libraries, including the main library. She's an in-demand speaker on issues of libraries, CX, design. She's also a CXPA board member. So welcome to you, Allison.
Thanks, Gabe.
So Allison, before we keep diving into these results, why do you think it's important to take an honest look at reasons why CX programs aren't successful?
I have a lot of mantras, and one is you can justify everything or anything. And so I always think if you're not honest about what you're doing, you can find ways to justify why you're doing it the way that you're doing. And so taking an honest look and not selling, not believing your own press, which is easy to do, that we're doing great. But to take an honest look is so critical. And gosh, it's just very challenging for me to think of anyone who, after the last 18 months, isn't taking a really hard look at the impact of the pandemic on how they have serviced customers for good and for bad. Out of that, I believe we can rise to even better things. But unless we fully understand exactly the implications of what we've been through, we're going to just be running in circles.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Taking an honest look is why we're here and diving into some of that. So totally agree with you. And just kind of looking at the chat, we've got a couple practitioners, we've got a consultant. Would love to continue to hear from you around where you fall in these three camps. So Farzad, let's go ahead and continue to start to walk through some of what you saw in the data.
Absolutely. So the first question we were asking is essentially, of the three areas that you think about from a CX perspective, right? Strategy, culture, and execution. What do our community feel is the most frequent cause of a CX failure, right? Or a challenge or a pain point? And it was really interesting to kind of see, and I would say across the personas, very similar in terms of what we saw as the results. Lack of CX strategy, almost 40% of the respondents felt like that was like, if they had to stack rank these, the number one reason that there's the failure or the obstacle that they're encountering, followed by customer-centric culture, and lastly, poor execution. We did have, a couple of respondents bring other areas. One was kind of, how do you relate it back to the bottom line as you think about your CX metrics, as well as a lack of comprehension of CX, whether you're looking at the executive suite or across the company from a culture perspective.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I want to talk a little bit about this finding that, so your strategy, lack of strategy, was sort of the number one reason here. And Allison, I want to ask you, as a chief customer experience officer, I would imagine that this question of, strategy and strategic alignment is something that you spend a lot of time thinking about. So what is your reaction to this sort of being the number one cited reason?
Well, I think, a lot of things going through my mind, one of which is I'm in the fortunate position that I lead the implementation of our public strategies and the CX strategy. So I can make sure that they connect together. But again, we've been in our plan for several years now. And I think where I find the deepest challenge is, okay, we implemented a plan, we did it. We were, I think, very successful at it. Okay, what's next? Especially coming out of the pandemic, what comes next? So that lack of a strategy, lack of common language, one of the first things I really focused on my role is making sure I wasn't the only one who had that understanding of customer experience, but really ran a lot of tutorials throughout the organization, had groups reading books together, brought in speakers, so that there was that cultural support for that strategy, but that I wasn't the only one out there staking what that strategy is, because of course people only support what they have a participation in. So to bring in that voice of frontline staff and managers was a really important part of creating that strategy. And unless you have all those pieces, you're going to be challenged.
Yeah, and I definitely hear you in that, strategy and culture, there's an inexorable link between those two. And, I'm curious about the audience reactions. There's definitely, let us know your thoughts in the comments as well. But Lorraine, I want to ask you, let's talk about culture in a little bit more detail. That was the next most commonly cited reason. So I was thinking about this, this quote that we've probably all heard, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think it's a Peter Drucker quote. And yet, here we have strategy, is the number one reason, with culture a close second. So talk a little bit about the relationship in your mind between strategy and culture, and where should CX professionals who are trying to succeed focus first? Is it always a joint effort to sort of build these things concurrently, or should the focus, where should the focus be first in your mind?
Yeah, so I think that there's a bit of a conundrum in that question, right? Because if you're not doing them in parallel, you're setting yourself up to potentially fail. But then the other question is if I don't have a strategy, how much can I, impact cultural change if you haven't really solidified that strategy? So to Allison's point, I'm always a proponent of make sure that your strategy fits the culture of your company. And that as you start to roll it out and execute on it, you've got to have change management as part of changing the culture of your company to be more CX and EX friendly. I think we saw in some of the comments that there are actually companies out there that are touted as being very, very good at CX. And yeah, they are good at CX, but the reality is that they've got such a great customer-centric culture that it makes it easier for them to be successful. So, I'm not sure that I really answered it, other than start with where you are, and they're both equally important in my mind.
Yeah. Really great points. As culture as an enabler of great strategy. So, I know that in any survey like this, there's a lot of richness to be found in the verbatim comments, that are left. So, Barzad, let's walk through a few of these that I think are interesting on the strategy angle. This person said insufficient alignment around the strategy and how it should be executed throughout the entire company. So, Allison, to your point, I think this person is sort of getting at exactly that sort of challenge.
Right. Well, and if you don't, and the thing is, you want everyone to be successful. You don't want to set people up for failure. And as a leader, your responsibility is to give people the tools and understanding so they can follow you and they can do what you want them to do. They want to do that. Certainly there are some who are obstructionists, but they will find their way out of the organization. If you create that culture, you reward people who are implementing that strategy and creating that culture at the local level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, and I also was very intrigued by this, and I think it aligns, Lauren, with what you were saying, that many CX teams have the right intent and strategies, but without the company truly being driven to have a customer-centric culture, it's extremely difficult to execute effectively on these plans. So, we've spent time in past Live with CXPA programs talking about culture and how to really drive culture. We've heard from people who've done, workshops over long periods of time to try to make sure that this is being sort of, adopted and inculcated into the culture of the company. So, in your view, how do we get this right? How do we get the culture right? We've got our strategy in place. What's next?
Yeah, it really is about those roadshows and about the education. People can't buy into a culture change or move up a formalized change management curve and start doing things differently if they don't comprehend it, if they don't understand it. And we all need to be honest here, right? Where everybody on this LinkedIn Live right now is either a practitioner or they're involved in CX. We understand the vernacular. We understand CX as a discipline, right? That it's not just VOC, it's not just experience design, et cetera. But it's really important to speak to everybody across the organization and educate them on their level and make it real for them, right? The old adage, what's in it for me? You've got to make what we want to do with CX across an organization, aligning with the strategy, real to everybody within that company. Is it the guy that's counting the beans in finance? Is it somebody on the front line who's answering the 800 number? They all have a different piece of CX that is going to be important to them to make them feel that they're contributing to the company. You've got to get into their emotions and educate them to want to anticipate and execute properly on all the things that you're trying to change within CX.
Yeah, absolutely. And y'all are getting some affirmations from the audience. Diella said, "So true. You got to show what's in it for me." Absolutely. Yeah. And I'd love to hear a dialogue with the community that's tuning in. I'd love to hear, because the title of this broadcast is "Why Do CX Programs Fail?" But the other side of that coin is, how do we keep that from happening? How do we sidestep some of these potholes that others have fallen into? So, would love to hear your thoughts on how you've successfully navigated some of these challenges that are being surfaced here in this data, because we're all about success stories. We want to hear what you're doing that's working really well. But so Farzad, we'd be remiss talking about strategy and culture if we didn't also talk about the impacts of poor execution. This person said there's no organization to catch the CX strategy, priorities, and CX deployment once aligned. So, when we talk about execution failure, in your mind, is this a culture failure? Is it something else entirely? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Gabe. And I 100% agree with Lorraine and Alison so far about what we've spoken. I think it's a definition of execution. A lot of times I find that when we're working with our customers, just checking the box of we have a program, we have the technology, we have the ability to collect the data and essentially interpret it is enough. And that's where I think the definition of execution probably should be broadened a little bit to actually measure change, right? So at the end of the day, as we think about this strategy, how aligned are we to bring change to the organization that is going to have a benefit both for the organization as well as the customers? And then do we have the ability, right? Have we enacted the responsibility across these teams to be actually able to have the time, right, allocated to make those changes as they look at sort of the customer experience feedback? So from my perspective, if we think about execution as having the technology, having the ability to produce and interpret the feedback, that's not enough. What we want to be able to see is for that execution to actually drive value. Is that going to have, similar to what this comment had said that you were showing earlier, right? Are we going to have the organization behind it, the executive team behind it? That's what's ultimately going to lead to success.
Can I add that I think these all kind of integrate into one another, because if you are successful in execution, you need to bake that back into the culture so that people see the connection to all of those, and then tell that story of that execution in the context of the overall strategy. I think what we're all good at check marks. Okay, we did it, but it then needs to cycle back around and reiterate among those other two pillars.
Yeah. And I'll jump in as well, Gabe. Sorry, this is Lorraine. So, those of you who know me, I'm originally from New Jersey, so I'm a Jersey girl. I'm cranky. I might live in Kentucky now, but I always ask, and throughout my career, I've said, so what, right? So you get insights. So what? What are you going to do with it, right? Now you've done something with it. So what? What are the results? So a somewhat crass way to look at it, but the reality is it's a three-legged stool, right? Strategy, culture, and execution. And everywhere along the way, Six Sigma is a little bit more polite about it, but you keep asking the question, so what? What do you do next?
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were talking before the broadcast, I was mentioning that, still seeing some CX roles where the person is sort of charged with running a VOC or an analytics program, but then also driving those insights throughout the organization and driving change and trying to deliver those results. That's a really heavy lift. So one of the things I'm hearing is give resources to your people, empower those CX professionals in your organization so that they can be successful.
Well, and they're totally different skills. I mean, I always, when I said that before, and even now, I'm like, oh my gosh, no, because I am not the analytical person, but I can drive change, I can create culture, I can create strategies, but you can't do it all, or you're going to do it poorly. And so what can we really, as a team, build and support one another with the skills that are required to be successful? And it's just unfair to expect somebody to be able to do all that, especially if they're not even in an executive level, because then you're just hitting your head on the wall trying to get people's attention.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of the data and some of the comments. So Farzad, talk to us about this slide. The question was, which of these three things do you feel has changed the most in the past 5 years? So take us through this, if you would.
Absolutely, yeah. So we asked this question, and again, if you look at the results, pretty much tied neck to neck together. Executive focus on CX and the whole company focus on CX. They continue to be very prominent in things that are sort of impeding on the success of the CX programs. And lastly, the ability to execute is what we found from this question.
And so this was the changes around ability to execute, executive focus on CX, whole company focus on CX, that these things had lessened over the past 5 years, or what direction was the change, or did that come out of the verbatims?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, they've basically become more of a challenge. So they've increased, and I think with the programs, it's interesting, right? Because the space continues to mature, right? And there's a lot more questions and dialogues around those questions. And again, these themes have been not only identified as those core structures of success, but actually now people are ranking these as things that have actually worsened over the last 5 years.
Yeah. Great thoughts. Allison or Lorraine, do you have any reaction to what was your reaction when you saw this data?
Well, that was the first thing I asked was, executive focus. Was that a positive or a negative? And because I had my own gut reaction from, people that I work with every day. And what we really saw within the verbatims was that, yes, there's more of a focus. So there's an improvement there. There are more executive focus on it. But the executive focus seems to have somewhat of a negative connotation because they're just trying to check the box. Many executives know they need CX, but they're not educated enough. They don't understand it. And so there's not true buy-in. So true buy-in and active participation from executives is still a huge struggle, but there's much more awareness. So if you look very slowly on the hype curve, we're starting to move up the curve with more executives being involved or talking the CX talk, but their actual action and buy-in and participating on a daily basis is still a struggle. So you've got the dichotomy of there's a lot of change, but it's also a little bit skewed negative.
Yeah.
To me,
So-
I think it's a lot. I was marketing director before, spent my life in marketing. It's like how people used to think about marketing, which is, oh, give it to the person who likes to draw, because that's what marketing is. And I worry that that's happened to the term customer experience. I've started to see it, and I see people touting it, but they tout the words without that deeper understanding. So I think that's the flip side of that awareness, is it can't just be that they understand it and hear the words and see the bot. It's what the rigor that goes underneath. There takes a practitioner who understands the profession in order to do that in a successful way.
Yeah. So how can we help executives get beyond that superficial view, or check the box, or even correcting misconceptions, because the term customer experience has become so prevalent? How can we help get past that, Lorraine?
I really think it's education, and you've got to sell to your executives, again, the what's in it for them, right? It's not just about budget. You're not just trying to get budget to buy technology or to launch a program or a project. It's really about getting them to understand how it's going to help them, how it's going to help the company, and how it's going to help your customers. I'm always re-quoting John Carbone over at Vox Pop Me. Says, you can't not have an experience. So your executives need to understand they're invested one way or the other in customer experience. It's really just a matter of, do they want to pay attention to it or not? Because no decision, no budget, ignoring it is still actually a decision, and it's still participating in CX. So you've got to educate them on all the discipline, not just a technology or one faction within CX.
Can I
Allison,
add that? No, I was going to make a comment about something you were saying, but the other thought I was having is that I think the CXXP credential was helpful for my organization to understand I'm not just cooking it up, but that there is rigor around it. And certainly I've talked about what was in it, and it's on my business card and my email signature to help give some credence to it. So I think that's an important tool.
Allison, that's great. And I'm going to add, I'm not just cooking it up on my email signature. I think that's great.
Oh, that's legitimate right there.
Gabe, what I would love to add also to the conversation is also seeing more of a commitment to CX, maybe within the executive suite, more roles like Allison, a chief customer experience officer, a chief customer officer. So showing that there's that commitment beyond just the checking of the box. We're going to incorporate, whether it's an NPS metric or another CX metric, to our scorecard, but more of that commitment that, hey, we're going to be behind this. We're going to open that role and bring or internally promote someone that has that understanding and can influence the change across the organization, and also bring a lot of those success stories and the art of how to tell those success stories across the organization. I think that will go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely, Farzad. Wholeheartedly agree. And, shameless promotion, if you check out CXPA.org, we've created a CXPA's Guide to Developing CX Job Descriptions. It's a great resource if you're filling a chief customer officer role, or really any CX role in your organization, and sort of want a guide to knowledge, skills, abilities that you should be looking for. Definitely worth taking a look at and downloading that one. Also want to bring in a few comments that we're getting from folks who were tuning in. Satish said, I'm not sure how many organizations develop a proper CX strategy in the first place, unlike, say, brand strategy, where there are more stakeholders involved, including ad agencies. And then there's the brand CX gap. Any thoughts on that comment? Anyone want to react?
Yeah,
Thoughts?
I'll jump in. I see a lot of my clients where, you're right. They've got a brand strategy, and then they create a CX strategy, and that strategy is not in alignment with, their brand, their vision, their mission. And so it becomes siloed, right? And so it's very challenging when I work with customers. It's really about getting those executives or whoever's in charge of CX to align that CX strategy with the whole company strategy. And what that does is A, it gains alignment on that CX strategy, but B, it brings in other people tangentially that may or may not be involved or think they need to be involved in CX.
Yeah.
Right. Because then you're putting CX elements into the brand strategy as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And what if you go through a brand refresh or something like that, and you've done this alignment work? So things like getting things aligned and keeping them aligned.
Yep.
Also can be a challenge.
I like what Lorraine just said too about even your CX strategy. As a person who was leading a slice of the organization, it is really easy for people not under my direct line to feel excluded. And so one of the things that your strategy can do is broaden it beyond that team, so that people, at one point I had IT and they were able to be in that, or security, or all those people, so that more people feel ownership and touch it and understand what's in it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark brings up a great point as well. He said, I'm very focused on increasing cross-functional engagement. Business silos remain intact. We have to do a better job integrating continuous CX insights into formal cross-functional business processes. And Mark, as a CCXP, I'm glad you're on the case on that one. I think that's very much aligned kind of with the discussion that we're having today. All right, so
I'd add in, and by the way, hi Mark, good to hear from you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Just
go
that
ahead.
a lot of companies are creating centers of excellence or focus areas where they're bringing other departments in to bring down those silos. They're sharing their insights, they're sharing their wins internally. So again, that helps with the culture change, but that also helps with the execution and getting a broader group of people involved in CX on a daily basis.
And the other thing that we see is that those teams do exist, not so much from a CX label, but you're always going to have your cross-functional team. For example, digital experience is really hot right now, right? Everybody wants to make sure not only do they have a digital experience, but that brings a lot of those capabilities just given the state of the world. But that has a huge impact, and also there's a huge data point from CX that can land to it. So a lot of times what we found is those teams exist. It's more getting in those circles and letting them know how the VOC data and how the CX side of it can actually influence the design, so that not only it achieves what the businesses want to achieve internally, but actually makes an impact on the overall customer experience.
Yeah, great point, Farzad. And I want to come back to the slides and dive into some more verbatims that I know that we got to sort of spur some conversations. This one was in regard to whole company focus on CX. This person said, as a CX professional, it is challenging to keep all the pieces moving if CX strategy is not monitored at the C-suite or by an individual that is held accountable for CX across all divisions, teams, and functions. So I think this is very much of a space of sort of the discussion that we've just been having around, keeping things moving, and how do you keep things moving if there's not one person who's accountable for all this work.
Right.
Yeah.
This is what I hear most frequently from people about their struggle, which is you stand up something, but who has the power really to make it happen? And it has to be driven. I would say it has to be driven for the top, or at near the top, or there's just no resources appropriately directed to make it successful.
Absolutely.
And I think it's not that different from marketing either. Okay, we're going to have a marketing department of somebody who likes to draw, and then somebody who'll be willing to talk to the media. There you go. Well, that's not good. Nothing's going to happen with that. Sorry, Lori.
That's okay. I just like to say that, when we built the program at Verizon, I knew I was successful when I had to, every Monday afternoon at 3:00, the CEO had his staff meeting. And I had 10 minutes on that agenda. They were 10 nerve-wracking minutes every week. But my job was to go in there in front of his direct reports and give them the state of what were the emerging trends, what we had accomplished from the week before. It wasn't just about, scores and what they were monitoring. I had to bring them exact customer examples and tell stories. And that's how you know when you're successful, when you get somebody at that level who says, I need you to show me what's happening every week or every 2 weeks. And then it flows out through the company from that point forward.
And I think from my perspective, it's a bit of an uphill battle, but the KPIs are there, right? So at the end of the day, the executives are going to be looking at retention, right, and churn. They're going to be looking at, the cost of the operation and efficiency opportunities. They're going to be measuring, right, their customer acquisition and lifetime value. So again, being able to, as a CX discipline, showing the linkage of how CX actually is a leading indicator for a lot of those will get the attention. And again, it's sharing those success, but it is an uphill battle at this stage.
Yeah, Lorraine, I think there's probably people who are listening who are envious of the 10 minutes, that you were able to secure, because, otherwise without that, then, you may be, like we said earlier, you may just be doing CX. You're doing things, you're playing whack-a-mole as problems come up, you're continuously improving. All those things are important, but, sort of without that buy-in, you're maybe not affecting some of that large scale change that we know is so necessary.
Right.
Yeah. So another interesting comment. There we go. I think a nod. Execs are more focused on CX, but in many ways superficially only small cosmetic steps into say we're doing CX. And then another comment, lots of talk, little action. So, again, I think we're getting to some themes that are coming through here, and a question that was just asked that I want to bring into the conversation. Any good public examples of brands that have well-articulated CX strategies? Of course, we want to be best in class, but yes, any examples that really come to mind that anyone wants to speak to?
For me, I can go. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Lauren.
go ahead. No, you go ahead, Farzad.
I was going to say, the classic example, Amazon. For me, kind of what stood out for me is, again, there's countless examples of needing to interact with Amazon to resolve the issue proactively or afterwards. But I'll never forget, based on one of the encounters that I had with the customer service department of Amazon, and really their slogan stood out to me, which was to be the Earth's most customer-centric company. I think from a mission statement perspective, it's ingrained in there. And as we look at their policies and procedures, it's ingrained into the entire overall experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And, I think for some of us in this space, like, we hear the familiar names, Amazon, it's like, you're kind of like, oh, here we go, Amazon. But, you make a great point in that it's really embedded into the DNA and not worth, sort of losing sight of that.
So I would be remiss as a practitioner if I didn't say we had a really good strategy that we've executed on. And I'm really proud to say that that we do. I had mentioned earlier, my biggest concern is we've hit the markers we established for ourselves. Then we had COVID, and so now what comes next? And that isn't as easy as building something up from scratch. And it took a long time for us to get that strategy in place and get it launched. But, that old saying, to go far, you have to sometimes go slow. And I often say, our strategy is something I could have written in a weekend, but then who would be there to follow me and execute? And people had to own it. We had to spend all that time. And then once we did that, we went really far, very fast. What is kind of sad is over the last year, we have this philosophy of customer first, and we have all these strategies of how we do that. Well, in the last year, we had to change that to safety first. And so now we got to go, no. Now, okay, yeah, some safety, but back to customer first. And how do you do that? But I think we've done a really good job on a smaller scale. We're no Amazon, but an organization that has 800 employees in multiple locations, we've done a really good job. And I would think the CXPA has really been outstandingly helpful in our achieving that.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear, Allison. And I think we all have to do more to share our success stories and things that we're proud of. And that's where, you know, I love hearing that from you and would love to hear from the community, because it's been a rough, you know, it's been a rough period. And, you know, let's hang our hats on some things that we're really proud of. So would love to hear in the comment section, like, what are you proud of as you've, you know, navigated the course of this past year? And so, you know, for that, I know we had some really, so sort of beyond some of these key themes, there are also some other key takeaways too. And one question he asked is, if you could change or focus solely on just one thing in CX, what would it be? So this comment I think is really interesting. Engaging a core of key opinion leaders from within the C-suite to publicize how CX has improved their overall results. What are your impressions of that comment?
Do you know that, remember that book, maybe as far as that, but it made me think of that book, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. I feel like that's a little bit what this is. It's like, okay, I'm doing this work. Please, somebody help me get to the finish line. Sorry, Farzad.
No worries. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And again, I think it's sharing the success, right? And getting to that point, right, that Lorraine was speaking, having the time to give the updates and sharing successes. I think continuous storytelling of the customer experience feedback, right, and how ultimately is going to impact those bottom line metrics that the executive teams care about.
Yeah, and Lorraine, you know, obviously we've got to get good results so that people want to say good things about us and all of that. But I think kind of at the core of this comment to me is it's about how do I secure an advocate? How do I get somebody who will help me tell this story? So any ideas or advice around that for folks tuning in?
Yeah, so it's almost kind of like the phone a friend, right? You find somebody in the C-suite that you can kind of latch onto, whether it's in your organizational reporting structure or not. Find somebody who can be an advocate, help them out, make them look good, right? Find one key success, and really, if you've got to do the extra work, do the extra work to help them get that one win, and then help them look like a hero. And then I mean, look, we're all human beings. Everybody else in the C-suite is going to kind of be like, I want some of that. Like, how come you're not helping me? And that's
Right.
just human nature, right? So sometimes in a more polite way, I will say, make sure you treat your C-suite as you would want them to treat your customers, right? Because your C-suite in some cases are your customer.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Great point. Absolutely. This next one is interesting too. Stop talking solely about technology as the answer.
Amen.
So I'll raise my hand here, right, and say I grew up in operations. I helped build the technology. Then I worked for a vendor, right? But it still goes back to the so what, right? You know, I was listening to a webinar the other day, and I think it was even Faith from Forrester that said, you know, everybody's so focused on research that it's not analysis paralysis. We're just admiring the research, but it's the taking action. Right. Technology is awesome. You can't make changes in your organization unless you have the data and the technology to help you identify what you need to change. But it's really about the so what. Now put on your big girl panties and go make a change.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say it's also about people. You know, change is about people. The technology enables that, but you still have people at the core, whether they're public facing, whether it's all back end, whatever, but those are the people that it's about that as much to me as the technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Technology. And can I also, and I find my one frustration in the whole CX world is I don't have that luxury of a whole lot of technologies to really support, but we do customer experience through our people, through design, through our all kinds of, there are lots of ways. And I think it's easy to say, well, if I get this tool, I've done CX. That's just kind of, it's not the easy part, but it's only a part.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've talked in this program before about, technology as an enabler of great CX led by qualified good people who understand what they're doing and how to use these tools most effectively. And I think
Farzad, you live that every day.
Yeah, I mean, the technology part excites me, Gabe, but also
Right.
what's exciting about it is, you can actually use that, but back to the group's comments, right? So what? It's how we then shape that to a story that's personalized to the audience that we're giving. And at the end of the day, when we're giving them the insight that they care about, the thing that's going to make them look good, that's where the engagement comes. So again, the technology is fabulous. It's come a long way. It can do a lot, but that's something for like the core team to take advantage of and kind of put that wrapper of the storytelling and the engagement outside of it to who you're communicating the insights to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to bring up, I know you had asked sort of is kind of an anything else type of question.
Yeah.
Anything else? CX should not be promoted as easy to do. CX leaders should be expected to possess comprehensive professional CX experience or certifications to successfully lead a business. And that, I want to spend just a little bit of time here. I know we've got a few minutes left. We're all CCXPs on this panel, so clearly we all believe in the power and the value of professional certification. But Allison, let me ask you, from your perspective as a CX leader, what message does certification convey to your peers and fellow members of your leadership?
I would say it puts me on a par with our CFO, the head of our HR, people who have other credentials, that it isn't just give it to somebody who likes to do it, but that there's a rig. And I would also say being a member of the CXPA, having attended those conferences, being on the board, all helps establish the credibility that this isn't just a feel good. We have a saying in my office that is that a do good or a feel good? And this is doing good because there's rigor around that enables us to tell it, but it can't, you also have to get back to that whole story idea. You got to tell the story about why those things matter, not just to say, here are all the elements of it. So I would say it really is that stamp of legitimacy, in all honesty.
Yeah, absolutely, and lending that credibility. Lorraine or Farzad, thoughts here?
Yeah, I totally agree. I love the quote here, easy to do. You guys can quote me on this. I say it all the time. CX is simple, but it is not easy. Right. And so you want to keep it simple, right? Keep it simple, stupid. But we want to keep it simple, but to actually execute on it is very, very difficult, right? There's 6 different disciplines within CX, right? Strategy, culture, adoption and accountability, metrics and measurement, VOC. There's so much to it, right? It's that unicorn that it's not easy.
Yeah.
And so you do need to have a certain level of education to around CX, but you also have to like walk a mile in those shoes in order to know how to run an organization or how to implement CX across a broad organization, right? I equate it to a lot like getting your driver's license, right? You can take the written test,
Right.
but if you can't parallel park or drive a stick shift, you're not getting your license, right? And so it's up to us to help cultivate giving people the practical application as well as the book learning of the different disciplines within CX.
Well, and I always say, if it were easy to do, everybody would be doing it.
Yep.
But it's not easy.
Right.
No?
I agree. And I haven't yet met the CX professional who is promoting CX as easy to do. I'm curious who they are. If you're out there, would love to meet you so I can learn from you and figure this all out. But that's great. This has been such a great conversation. Love all the comments that are coming in as well. So I want to ask you as we near the end of this broadcast, just to give us your final thoughts on this research. What's a key takeaway that you want to leave the audience with? So Farzad, I'll start with you on this one.
Absolutely. I think, the challenges are known. Let's keep advocating it within our organizations, right? Bring recommendations where we can. From my perspective, it was really humbling to kind of get to hear from the community and validate that, at least from what I'm seeing, what we're talking with Lorraine, with Allison and others, we're not alone. And lastly, I would essentially kind of leave the participants with, you know, the CCXP, the certification. So I've been working in CX for almost 10 years now, and I'm guilty of one of those people initially that I thought CX is easy, right? And from all of the experiences that I had and had gone through, I thought I knew CX. But the more I experienced, the more sort of like curious I became, and you know, ended up actually studying and taking my CCXP exam just earlier this year. And it was a very humbling experience. I learned a lot through the process, learned a lot about the 6 disciplines, and that really influenced and changed my thinking. So I would also definitely recommend, you know, to the community, if you have not, you know, studied or have not signed up, to actually go through the certification process. It was a really awesome experience for me.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Allison. What's a key takeaway for you from this?
My key takeaway is actually thank you. Thank you to Lorraine and Farzad for taking this on and kind of doing almost a state of the profession as we launch into this next phase post-pandemic, and really spurred to me a really thoughtful conversation today. And that because it's hard and it's a struggle doesn't mean it's not work worth doing. And that a lot of us are sharing some of the same issues. So come together, use the CXPA, go to your network meetings, have conversations that we can lift this profession and its impact together.
Yeah, great point, Allison. Thank you for your leadership. Lorraine, I'll end with you. What is your key takeaway?
Yeah, so I think my key takeaway is the same as when I started the blog and when I was thinking at the beginning of the year, that, you know, the 3 cornerstones are still the same 3 cornerstones, but it has evolved and changed drastically over the last 8 to 10 years. And to Allison's point, that means that those 3 key pillars are still important. And unless we as a community and a group of professionals continue to talk to each other, network with each other, and promote the success stories to help everybody do better, that's what will move us forward, right? The world is constantly changing. We need to adapt, but you still have your 3 cornerstones of what's important. It's really about how we address it, and CXPA and being a CCXP can really help with that moving forward.
Fantastic. I want to thank all of my guests today. You all have been fantastic. Thank you for a really thoughtful and in-depth conversation around a topic I think is just so critical for all of us. So appreciate each of you.
Well, thank you, Gabe. And thanks to all the people who joined us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely.
Have a great day.
So thank you, everyone. That's it for this edition of Live with CXPA. We hope that you're going to join us back here tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We're going to have a conversation with Sri Lanka's Sandra Dezoisa, CCXP. We touched a little bit on digital transformation today. She has a really great case study around aligning vision and values to drive digital transformation at Dialog Axiata, which is actually one of Sri Lanka's biggest telecommunications service providers. So I hope you join us back here tomorrow morning. Until then, talk to you soon.